Hey guys, welcome back to Artist Overview, Episode 5. Today we're going to be talking about Louis Armstrong. Now, it's been a long time leading up to this, and again, I'm sorry it took long. Sometimes it's hard to anticipate with these discography overviews how long they might take to listen to and get the shorts out and prep the videos and edit and all that. So I'll try and be better in the future, but my apologies for this situation. Without further ado, let's get right into this review. Louis Armstrong was born on August 4th in 1901 in New Orleans, Louisiana, USA. He was raised between his grandmother and mother, and he kind of spent time between the two of them, depending on what age he was. Following that, he was fostered by Lithuanian Jews, who provided a great influence on his music taste at the time. He joined his first quartet in 1912. In that same year, he was sent to a juvenile detention center for firing a gun. Following that, he played in various bands like Fletcher Henderson Orchestra, the Williams Blue Five, the Hot Five, and Erskine Tate's Little Symphony, as well as the Hot Seven. Louis Armstrong was influenced by King Oliver, Buck Johnson, and Freddie Keppard. Before we get into the albums, I would like to provide the disclaimer that with older artists like this, and you saw in the past with my Duke Ellington video, not all their albums are as easily accessible as some of the newer artists. And because of that, if they aren't really on Spotify or YouTube, I'm probably not going to review them, and I apologize, but it's just difficult with some of these guys, especially if they have heavy discographies. It makes it even harder. I would also like to say that throughout these albums, I'll be recommending 3 songs per album, obviously dependent that is available. And throughout these songs that I think are particularly standout tracks, I'll be compiling them in a playlist that I will leave a link to in the description if you're curious to check out on your own. And that will be on Spotify. Anyways, let's get right into it. In 1944, Louis Armstrong released his first album, Jazz Classics. This album was recorded on Brunswick Records, and it is the first example of one of his albums that were not available on streaming. So there isn't a whole lot of input or information available regarding it. 8 years later, he released Satchmo Serenades in 1952. This album was recorded on Decca, and it's a strong album with good horn and piano laid throughout. It lacks some percussion and instead replaces it with horn, which I thought was a really interesting touch. The 3 songs I'd recommend from this album are C'est Si Bon, When We Are Dancing, and La Vie en Rose. Two years later, Louis Armstrong released Louis Armstrong Plays W.C. Handy. This was his first album released on Columbia Records, and it was described by AllMusic as his finest album of the 50s. It features good bluesy work that presents a good track list with tasteful instrumentals. The vocals are uneven, but they have high peaks when they're really good. It also runs a little long and gets partly repetitive, but it's still a worthwhile listen in my opinion. From this album, I'd recommend Aunt Hagar's Blues, Hesitating Blues, and Yellow Dog Blues. In the following year, 1955, Louis Armstrong released Satchmo Plays Fats. I should also take this time to disclaim that Louis Armstrong goes by Satchmo, if you didn't know that already. So that's who these are referring to. This album was obviously a tribute to the legendary Fats Waller, and in my opinion, it comes across as mediocre. It kind of has that Christmas feel that a lot of Louis Armstrong albums have, despite not actually being Christmas albums. However, on this piece, a lot of the songs sound alike, and it kind of disrupts the pacing of the album as a whole. From it, though, I recommend Squeeze Me, I'm Crazy About My Baby, and What Did I Do to Be So Black and Blue. In the same year, he released Satchmo Sings. This album is subpar. It has mediocre lyrics, However, it also comes across as a Christmas album again, but however, it's not. And overall, it's just also uneven. I'd recommend, Sincerely, I Wonder, and Someday. In the following year, 1956, Louis Armstrong released Satchmo the Great. This album is good. It's very long and is probably best listened to in multiple sittings. It presents a warm atmosphere and a unique experience. The narrations are fun, and the album includes some hits. The 3 tracks I recommend from it are When It's Sleepy Time, Down South, What Did I Do to Be So Black and Blue, and the St. Louis Blues, in brackets, Concerto Grasso. In that same year, we witnessed one of music's legendary collabs, specifically jazz music's legendary collabs, between Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong. This album also featured, alongside those two, Oscar Peterson, and it was one of the first of 3 collaboration albums between Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald. It was voted number 636 in Colin Larkin's Top 1,000 Albums, and Bjork cited this album as one of her favorites in 1993. The front half of this record is essentially perfect, with the 2 voices blending very well with the instrumentation. The second half dips considerably and honestly drags the runtime, but even with that, it's still one of the best collaborations and album collaborations ever made. Also to note, it was his first record recorded on the Verve label. The 3 songs recommended from this are Can't We Be Friends, Isn't This a Lovely Day, and Moonlight in Vermont. In the next year, we witnessed a sequel to that, in Ella and Louis Again. This album features many solo tracks, unlike the previous, and the Oscar Peterson trio returns as well. The album was again long and overall inconsistent. There are some bangers here for sure, but also many tracks that fall flat, especially the isolated ones. This somewhat made it feel like a compilation of just kind of like the leftovers of that session. However, it's still a significant piece of jazz history, and is a really seriously good album, nonetheless. I recommend Don't Be That Way, Autumn in New York, and Learning the Blues. The next album, in the same year, we have Louis and the Angels. This is loosely a concept album, with the set list referring to angels. However, it's just kind of subpar overall, and the backside is especially weak and repetitive. A kind of nagging criticism I have for Armstrong albums. There are 4 song structures in this album that are essentially identical, and definitely not the go-to Louis album to check out. 3 songs I recommend off it, though, are When Did You Leave Heaven, Angel Mia, and You're a Heavenly Thing. In the following year, 1958, we had Louis Under the Stars. This album was arranged by Russell Garcia. It received favorable reviews from Billboard. AllMusic provided it with unfavorable reviews, and I think it's quite subpar. Outside some standout tracks, this album doesn't do a lot. They're good song choices, but repetitive performances done upon them. I recommend Stormy Weather, Top Hat, White Tie, West of the Moon, and East of the Sun, West of the Moon. In the next year, we have Louis Armstrong meets Oscar Peterson. This is their first collaboration, barring Ella Fitzgerald. This one's another prominent mix, though, regardless. And Oscar Peterson really steps up on this record. He really shines on this, adorning the whole album with delightful instrumentals. Louis is inconsistent throughout. However, the album is still very much so worth listening to. I'd recommend Blues in the Night, Just One of Those Things, and That Old Feeling from this one. In that same year, we have Porgy and Bess. This is one of my favorite albums, and it was the third and final collabs of Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong. It won a Grammy Award long after its release in 2001. This, however, also includes isolated tracks, which I believe weaken the album, but its best songs are legendary, and I think Louis especially steps up on this track, or on this record, sorry. From this, I'd recommend Summertime, Buzzard Songs, Here Come Old Honey, Crabman, Oh Days, So Fresh and Fine Medley. It's a long song name because it's a medley. Sorry about the jumble of words. Then in the same year, we have Louis and the Good Book. This album surprised me. It did not sound like the typical religious album, and came across more as a Christmas piece, like a lot of his other tracks and albums. Most songs are solid, and I found the less they incorporated the choir, the better the songs turned out. Shadrach is especially good. The 3 songs I recommend off this one are Shadrach, On My Way, and Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen. In that same year of 1959, and my god, he's released a lot of albums in 1959, he released Satchmo in Style. This album isn't great, it runs on too long, and the songs blend together. Most of the songs don't suit Louis' singing style, and it also evokes that Christmas feel. But even in this niche, Armstrong has better albums. From it, though, I recommend Big Butter and Egg Man, You're Just in Love, and Indian Love Call. In the same year, he released 5 Pennies. This album features Danny Kaye, and while Armstrong isn't awful on this, Danny Kaye definitely is. His voice is simply insufferable to me, personally. And it's also his first album on audio fidelity. The 3 tracks I recommend from this are Wail of the Winds, Good Night, Sleep Tight Medley, and the 5 Pennies medley. Louis Armstrong's final album of the 50s and final album of 1959 is Satchmo Plays Oliver King. This is not his first album on audio fidelity. It's his second album on audio fidelity. And it starts off really strong as a sweet tribute to his mentor, Oliver King. Unfortunately, the majority of it is quite similar, repetitive, and devoid of personality. It's very bluesy, which I think is a pocket Louis excels in. Despite this, you can bypass this album. On it, I recommend St. James Infirmary, I Want a Big Butter and Eggman, and I Ain't Got Nobody. In the next year, Louis Armstrong released his first album of the 60s with I've Got the World on a String, released in 1960. This album was arranged by Russell Garcia, and it was recorded on the same day as Louis Under the Stars. Billboard gave it favorable reviews. However, this album isn't on streaming, so I don't have any more input or recommendations to provide you for it. Fortunately, in that same year, Louis Armstrong released one of his best albums, and one of the only ones I'd recommend to everybody, being in Satchmo. This is another prominent collaboration in jazz, this time featuring Bing Crosby. It was arranged by Billy May too, a legendary producer, and it received it received favorable reviews from Billboard magazine. Bing is at the top of his game here, and I think that this album is perfect. The only potential criticism is that it's repetitive, and even despite that, I think all the songs are great. I would check out from this one, Sugar, Little Old Tune, and At the Jazz Band Ball. In 1961, Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington released The Great Reunion. This is another huge collaboration in jazz. Louis performs very well here vocally, but Duke kind of steps down. The 3 tracks I'd recommend from this are Azalea, I Don't Get Around Much Anymore, and It Don't Mean a Thing If They Don't Got That Swing. In the same year of 1961, Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington released another album called Together Again. Obviously, another pivotal collaboration and clashing of 2 jazz professionals. However, this one isn't available on any streaming sites, so I couldn't get you any more input about it aside from that, nor any recommendations, unfortunately. In 1962, Louis Armstrong released The Real Ambassadors. This album is another big collaboration, this time with Dave and Lola Brubeck. This is a concept album addressing several major topics like the civil rights movement, the Cold War, and the nature of God, as well as many other things. A very ambitious piece. It was received extremely controversially, as the politics expressed in it were not shared by all listeners. I found the album mediocre, which is unfortunate considering the great ambitions and high-profile personnel featured upon it. 3 songs I recommend from it are Everybody's Comin', They Say I Look Like God, and Remember Who You Are. 2 years later, Louis Armstrong released Hello, Dolly in 1964. This was his first album on the Cap label, and it was very well received, though critics recognized Armstrong as past his prime on the piece. I thought the record was mediocre, and was wholly devoid of any standout tracks, aside from the title track, Hello, Dolly. Every song following that, though, dips in quality. The 3 tracks I recommend off it are Hello, Dolly, It's Been a Long Time, and Blueberry Hill. 5 years later, in 1969, Louis Armstrong released another album. This time, Here's Louis Armstrong. Or this time it's called Here's Louis Armstrong. Aside from being released on Vocalion Records, I couldn't find anything else about this. And it wasn't available on any streaming platform, so I can't really give much more input. Sorry, that was released on 1968. My mistake. In that same year, he also released Disney Songs the Satchmo Way. This album was his first released on Buena Vista Records, and it's a compilation piece of Disney tracks that were interpreted by Louis Armstrong. This album also featured Louis Armstrong's final trumpet recordings, and he was personally asked by Walt Disney to record it in 1966. However, it was not completed until after Walt died. He was apparently ill while recording this, but still triumphed anyways. And I thought this album has 2 really great tracks and 8 bad ones. At least bad when standing alone. The only reason I say this is that they're produced poorly, and the instrumentals throughout, aside from on those 2 tracks, are quite mediocre. On it, I'd recommend Whistle While You Work, Zippity Doodah, and 10 Feet Off the Ground. The next album Louis Armstrong released is I Will Wait For You in the same year of 1969. This album is decent. There are about 5 good songs, but most of the tracks on it are repetitive. However, there's a lot of good soul influence on this album, and I'd recommend checking it out for that alone. The 3 songs I'd recommend from it are Sunrise, Sunset, You'll Never Walk Alone, and Rosie. In that same year, Louis Armstrong released one of my favorite albums from him, probably my favorite, and definitely one I'd recommend to everybody, What a Wonderful World. This was Louis' first release on ABC Records, and is perfect from start to end. I view it personally as his magnum opus, and it features his biggest song, which is one of the most beautiful ones ever recorded. The production is also spectacular. Every song hits, and his singing is the best that it is in his whole career here. It's 100% worth checking out, and I implore you all to do so. The 3 songs I recommend from it are What a Wonderful Life, Cabaret, and I Guess I'll Get the Papers and Go Home. The next year, in 1969, Louis Armstrong released his final album of the 60s, The One and Only. Unfortunately, this album was not released on streaming, and I couldn't find any information regarding it. So I can't give you any input nor songs recommendations for this. In the next year, the first year of the 1970, Louis Armstrong released Louis' Country and Western Armstrong. Armstrong vocals were dubbed over instrumentals on this because his health was so poor to appear in person. This was also his first shift into a different genre of country, which was quite a bold undertaking, but I think he did it quite well. The album received mixed reception, and in my opinion, it's actually quite strong. I think his voice lends far better to country than it does to jazz, and I think the deep raspiness and low tempo of his voice is executed perfectly here. I actually do also recommend checking this one out. It's very unique and very different. The 3 songs on it I recommend are Miller's Cave, Almost Persuaded, and Get Together. In that same year of 1970, Louis Armstrong dropped his final album, Louis Armstrong and His Friends. Critics describe the album as non-essential, but still an interesting listen, and it features some different versions of songs he's recorded in the past. Now everybody listen to me while I say this. This album has damn near flawless production. It's incredible. It's completely different from every other album in his career, even the one featuring What a Wonderful World, What a Wonderful World. It almost comes off as a soul record because of this. And you could tell that the contemporary artists at the time, the Marvin Gayes, the Stevie Wonders, were definitely influencing how this was produced. It's very nice, a very pleasant listen. From it, I'd recommend We Shall Overcome, Everybody's Talking, and What a Wonderful World. Now, Louis Armstrong influenced a lot of people, a lot of artists. He was a huge figure in jazz, and his sound was pivotal to the continuation and development of the genre. Such artists include Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald, and Frank Sinatra. Louis Armstrong died on July 6, 1971, of a heart attack in his sleep. His funeral was held at Corona Congregational Church in New York. It was attended by several famous collaborators that he worked on those albums with. His last words were unfortunately not recorded. Louis Armstrong married 4 times, all before his career really started to take off, and he started dropping albums. The first was to Daisy Parker in 1919, then Lynn Harden Armstrong in 1924, then Alpha Smith in 1938, and finally Lucille Wilson in 1942. All great marriages, and he had 2 kids throughout all those. Now, I'd like to thank you guys all if you made it to this point in the video. This was a lot of time researching, a lot of time listening to albums, and I really do appreciate all you guys tuning in, sorry. Once again, I'd like to mention I have compiled a playlist of a bunch of these songs I recommended that I thought were worthwhile to listen to. If you'd like to check them out in the description, you can. Spotify, it's free. I'd recommend it if you really wanted to. Anyways, stay tuned for more videos and shorts. I will hopefully be more consistent in the near future. and I'll try my best for you guys to get more videos out, especially. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the 5th installation of Artist Overviews, and take care.